theyeshiva.net.
We are in middle of the introduction of the Rambam Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon to his monumental magnum opus halachic work, Mishneh Torah, also known as Yad HaChazaka. So please open your introduction. The previous two classes we explored the first part of the Rambam's introduction, and today we reach the final part of his introduction. We are by the words Udvarim halalu b'dinim gzeiros v'takanos u'minhagos sheneschachu acher chibur Talmud. We finished last time the words Ein shaymin l'rishayn elo l'misha adas noita l'dvarav bein rishayn bein acharei. We're holding by the words Udvarim halalu. The Rambam gave a brief and concise bird's eye view of the tradition, the development of the Messiah, of Yiddishkeit, of Torah, of Halacha, of mitzvahs, from Moshe Rabbeinu all the way through the era of the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, which was composed by Rav Ashi and his son and students and disciples, as the Rambam put it, approximately 400 years after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. And the Rambam's point was that the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, was the compilation, the ultimate authoritative compilation that included not only an interpretation and elucidation of the Mishnah, but it includes also, as a result of that, all of the oral traditions, laws, customs, interpretations on all of the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah that were passed down orally from generation to generation from Moshe Rabbeinu. In addition to that, also, all of the new circumstances and situations that rose up throughout the centuries and the millennia, where the courts, the Sanhedrins, the Jewish courts of each generation had to delve into the pre-existing texts and laws that were received, using the methodology, the formulas that they learned and received from Moshe about how to deduce new laws from the text, about how to interpret the text, known as the Midas Shatayr and Idreshes Behen. That too was included in the Talmud. Included also was also the traditions, the customs, the edicts, the decrees that were added by the courts, by the sages, by the prophets throughout the generations. What we know as the rabbinic mitzvahs or rabbinic injunctions or rabbinic prohibitions, all that was included in the Babylonian Talmud. And the Rambam says afterwards, because the Sanhedrin was dissolved, the main central body of the Jewish people that combined the greatest leaders and scholars of all the segments of the Jewish community and really united the entire Jewish people under that central spiritual and legal authoritative body, that was dissolved somewhere in the 400s before the composition of the Babylonian Talmud. So afterwards, there are many, many courts in many communities, but the Jews were completely scattered and diversified with inability to be able to communicate or even travel and connect the way they used to do it before. You didn't have the thousands and thousands of Jews coming together, learning and delving into the text of the Torah and the text of the Mishnah and so forth. And therefore he says, after that, if there is an injunction or an instruction or a safeguard protection created by one bezdin, one court in a particular country or location, community, it binds the Jews who are living there, who follow their instruction and guidance, but not other Jews. That's a very brief summation of what we learned. And he continues, let's see inside. Udvarim halalu, all this is true, b'dinim, the laws, gzeiros, edicts, takados, institutions, minhagos, customs, shenischachu acher chibur Talmud, which were innovated, developed after the composition of the Babylonian Gemara, Talmud Bavli, in the 400s, the end of the 400s. Avol kol advarim shebetalmud habavli, but all of the items that exist in Gemara, in Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, chayavin kol Yisrael olechas behem. This obliges all of the Jewish people universally. V'koifen kol ir, v'chol medina medina, linoig b'chol ha-minhagos shenagu chachmei ha-Talmud, v'ligzig zeiroisen v'laleches b'takanoisen. Hayil, v'chol oisam hadvarim shebetalmud hiskimu aleim kol Yisra. We compel the Jews living in every single city and in every single country and province to follow all of the traditions and customs that were instituted by the sages of the Talmud, to follow the decrees that they created, the edicts that they created, to follow their institutions, those customs and traditions that they instituted. Why? Because if it's recorded in the Talmud, it's something that was collectively agreed upon by all of Klal Yisrael, by all of the Jewish people. Because till the time of the Talmud, you had that central body that connected and united all of the Jewish people. True, it was not like in the first Commonwealth or even in the second Commonwealth. That's why Rabbi wrote the Mishnah, because he saw the beginning of the dispersion of the Jewish people to far local locations, and therefore he needed to transcribe the oral tradition. But hundreds of years later, even the Sanhedrin dissolved. And once the Talmud Bavli was written subsequently, he says there's no law that is initiated and created by the central body that unites all the Jewish people and is agreed upon and embraced by all of Klal Yisrael. And therefore, you do not compel every city and every country to follow it. So that's what he says. In the Talmud Bavli, though, it was something that was agreed upon, it was embraced by all of the Jewish people. Because they had that connection, they had that communication, and there was that, things were centralized, and there was a tremendous sense of unity, and there was communication, even though there was the community in Eretz Yisrael, in the Holy Land, there was community in Babylonia. Talmud Bavli was written in Babylonia, but he says you could say on it that iskimu aleim kol Yisrael, it was agreed upon by all of the Jewish people. V'oisam ha'chachamim she'iskinu o she'gozru o she'inhigu o she'donu din v'limdu sha'mishpat kachu hem kol chachmei Yisrael oyruba. This comes with one more point, and that is the sages who instituted it, or made the decree, or made the custom, or issued the judgment, or taught that this is the right law and this is the right interpretation. Who were these people? You have all the sages of Israel, or the majority of them. And they heard the tradition of the fundamentals of Torah, the entire Torah, generation after generation, back to Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore, you had here, when you had the Sanhedrin functioning, you had all of the sages of the Jewish people. The best, the greatest, both in terms of knowledge, in terms of scope, in terms of depth, in terms of integrity, in terms of spirituality. And these were all people who were ordained by teachers, who could trace back the lineage all the way to Moshe Rabbeinu. So they sat for years and they learned how to learn Torah, how to understand Torah, what are the oral traditions that came with Torah, what came from Moshe Rabbeinu, what was added later, what are the formulas, what are the methodology, how to deduce, how to interpret. And because of that, in this unbreakable chain and dynasty of the tradition of Torah from Moshe Rabbeinu, you can create decrees and institutions that would oblige all of Klal Yisrael, all of the Jewish people. But that's only till the time of Talmud Bavli, when you had a decision that was made not by one sage or one rabbi or a few sages or a few rabbis, but literally he says all of the sages of the entire Jewish people, or more, or most of them at least, who came together and discussed this and debated this, and then they took a vote, and you followed the majority. So that has a different level of authority. And then it was communicated to all of the Jewish people who agreed. It's two elements, because as we're going to see much later in Rambam and Hilchas Mamre, if the court makes an institution but the community doesn't accept it, because it doesn't work. Sometimes it just doesn't work. It becomes nullified. We're going to get into that later. So Rambam here emphasizes two things. First of all of Klal Yisrael accepted it. Beautiful expression somebody once shared with me that he heard from the Lubavitcher Rebbe in the 1940s. He said, Klal Yisrael, there is something called Ruach HaKodesh, something called divine inspiration that certain individuals have. Every person has it, but most of us have static, so we block this inspiration. But certain people are transparent souls, so the inspiration flows through them. But he said, Klal Yisrael hat, in Yiddish, Klal Yisrael hat, kollektive Ruach HaKodesh. So just a beautiful expression. The Jewish people have collective divine inspiration. There's something called Hiskimu Kol Yisrael. The immune system of Klal Yisrael is sacred. The way Chazal put it, Yisrael Kedoshim Heim. They're a holy people. Of course, this one has flaws, this one has flaws, I have flaws, he has flaws, you have flaws. But Klal Yisrael has a collective Ruach HaKodesh. There's like the consensus of Klal Yisrael. Whereas the Gemara says in Shabbos Tzaddik, Ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim. There is a holiness that flows through the sinews of Klal Yisrael, the body of the Jewish people. So the Rambam says, the fact that all of the Jewish people accepted these mitzvahs, these institutions of the rabbis, of the prophets, and it was initiated and created by all Chachmei Yisrael, it gives it a different level of authority. That ceases with Talmud Bavli. It's the end of an era. It's not the end of the tradition, God forbid. Not the end of Torah at all. We're sitting here today learning Rambam, and the Rambam is writing this 500 years after the Talmud Bavli was composed, a little more than 500 years. But it's the end of a certain era. You have to recognize boundaries between one generation and another generation. And it's not just majority. Again, I'm emphasizing these words because it gives you an appreciation of how meticulous the tradition of Judaism is, how it's passed on, how everything is accounted for. There's absolutely no anarchy. There's no gaps. Everything is accounted for, and it has its place. It's put in context of where it happened, when it happened, how it happened, by whom it happened. It's not just the majority of sages. It's sages who were directly linked in the chain all the way up to Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, each one of those sages who was part of this collective decision can say, I learned by him, and by him, and by him, and him, who learned by him, and him, who learned by him, and him, who learned, all the way. You're going to get back to Yeshua, Elazar, Pinchas, the Skenim, and you ultimately get back to Moshe Rabbeinu. The power of that direct chain is incredible, both in terms of intellectual integrity, in terms of clarity, in terms of responsibility, and in terms that you are really, there is a loyalty. In other words, I am directly continuing that chain. And because there was still a cohesiveness in the Jewish world, therefore, this infrastructure can still exist. At some point, this infrastructure could not exist anymore. And then a Sanhedrin, a single body that would govern the Jewish people, could only be something that's hijacked and abducted, and it could become actually the source of corruption. I want you to understand this. When they dissolved the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, it wasn't just a tragedy. We don't have it anymore. In many ways, it was also one of the most advantageous and beneficial decisions for the Jewish people. Because when you don't have that infrastructure that allows for the integrity of such a system can be dangerous. Because, Animal Farm, we're all equal, but some people are more equal than others. When such a central body is abducted and hijacked by corrupt forces, now your entire nation is subject to their corruption. I don't know if you know, but Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France in the early 1800s, created a Sanhedrin. He created France, he got one of the great rabbis of the time, Rabbi David Zitzenheim, to sit at the head of the Sanhedrin. He felt he had to because Napoleon was so powerful, and if not, the Jewish people would be really in trouble. And he wanted this Sanhedrin to institute new laws in Jewish life. This is, I think, 1807, right? But this was, of course, the Jews knew this was a fake Sanhedrin. This is Napoleon's Sanhedrin. It's the antithesis of what the Sanhedrin was. The entire identity of Sanhedrin was absolute dedication and loyalty to the highest standards of intellectual and spiritual integrity of the tradition of Torah and mitzvahs. So now let's see what happens next stage. All the sages who arose after the composition of the Talmud. Vanuvoi means they comprehended it, they learned it. Vanu from the word bina. They analyzed it, they dissected it, they delved into it, they understood it. And they got a name because of their wisdom. They have now a new title in Jewish history called Ga'onim. A Ga'on is the term that we use for a genius. They're called Ga'onim. The genius is the great scholars. It's also Ga'on is the numerology of 60. because Gimel is 3, Aleph is 1, that's 4, Vav is 6, so that's 4 and 6 is 10, and Nun is 50, 60, because the Gaonim had to be masters of all the 60 tractates of Shas. The Talmud is basically divided into 60 tractates. There are other divisions where it becomes 63, but generally 60 tractates, and the Gaon had to be the master of all 60. So these are the sages in the subsequent generations of the Talmud. The Talmud began to be composed. The Rambam said, we learned earlier, in the year 470 after the Common Era, 400 years after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. And it was finished somewhere at the end of the 5th century or somewhere in the 6th century, the 500s. After this begins a new era in Jewish history, the era of the Gaonim. And this will continue for a few hundred years. All of these sages, Sha'amdu Be'eretz Yisrael, who lived in the Holy Land, in the land of Israel, Be'eretz Shinar, in Babylonia. Shinar is Babylonia, present-day Iraq. Ubisfard in France. Ubitzarfas in Spain. Limdu derech ha-Talmud. They taught Jews the path of the Talmud. Vaitziu lar talum moisav ubiyaru inyonav lefisha derech amuka darkei ad lema'it. They also extracted and revealed the secrets of the Talmud. They also elucidated and explained the themes of the Talmud. Because the path and the voyage of Talmud is exceedingly profound. Its depth is, the Rambam says, is marvelous, is extraordinary. Ad lema'od. Learning Gemara is delving into a literature, a wisdom that is unique and very, very deep, complex, and profound. Va'od. In addition to that, the language is Aramaic mixed with other languages, which in the time when the Gemara was composed, that language was common and known to all of the Jews who lived in Babylonia. Abu Bashar Mekaimis and other locations, and even in Babylonia, in the generations of the Gaonim post-Talmud Bavli, nobody knows that language well until they don't really learn it. So first of all, you have the language barrier. Besides the language barrier, he says you have the concept barrier. The Gemara is very, very deep. And when the Rambam is saying here the Gemara is very deep, it doesn't only mean that you have to spend time on it. For sure you have to spend time on it. It means that the surface, if you're learning it at the surface and you got it, it means you didn't get it. Because every idea, every statement, every observation, every question, every answer, every refutation, every proof, every story, every lesson, every teaching, every law has layers and layers of depth, not only to understand the subject matter itself or the idea itself, but also to appreciate the underlying paradigms behind every one of the Talmudic sages who expounded on ideas and developed ideas. They had paradigms, and these paradigms were philosophical, psychological, theological, spiritual, and of course, legal and concrete. So it comes with tremendous amount of depth, the Gemara. And you have to know its path, you have to know its perspectives, you have to know its hashkafa, its Weltanschauung. And every individual who is quoted in Gemara has his own unique Weltanschauung. And as a result of that, the Rambam says the Gaonim felt the need to explain this, both in terms of the concepts and in terms of the language. Jews in every city would send many questions to the Gaon that lived in their day in order to explain to them the difficult ideas in the Gemara. And the Gaonim would respond according to their knowledge and wisdom. And those who asked these questions, what they did was, the questionnaires, they started to compile the responses that they received from the Gaonim, and they turned them into books. This is before the printing press, of course, but they manuscripts, which they could use to study, and they could use to learn, and they could use to guide their communities. So they would compile the answers that they received from the Gaon who lived in their time. In addition to answering questions, the Gaonim in each generation composed various halachic works to explain the Gemara. Mehem, those Mishapirish halachas yichidos. Some of them explained individual laws. Mehem, some Mishapirish prakim yichidim sheneskashu b'yamav. Gave an explanation, they wrote an explanation to individual chapters in the Talmud, which became very difficult in his days, in the days of this Gaon. Umehem, some of them, Yishapirish Mesechtas Zdarim, wrote a commentary to complete tractates in Gemara, or even Zdarim, complete sections in the Gemara. They also composed books with clear verdicts, not only explanations of the Gemara, but clear-cut halachis, verdicts in issues of things that are permissible or forbidden, those who are liable or those who are exonerated, in issues that were contemporary. The Jews needed to know, so that the person who cannot delve into the depth of Gemara should still have access to this knowledge. And this is the work of God that all of the Gaonim of the Jewish people were involved in from the day that the Talmud Bavli was composed until this very time when the Rambam is writing. When is this time? The Rambam here gives us the date when he's writing these words. Shehi, this is Shana Shminis, Achar Meya ve'elef l'churban habayis. This is the 8th year after 1,100 years passed since the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Vihi, this is Shnas Arba'as Alaf Musham Meyas Shloishim B'Shevel Abriyas. This is 4,907 and 37 years since the creation of the world. 4937 since the creation of the world. Now this is very important because the Rambam here gives us the date of his writing the introduction, which would be in the secular calendar would be 1177. 1177, which in the Jewish calendar would be 4,937 since the creation of the world, right? How do I get to the year 1177? Here you right away see that the Rambam believed or understood or knew that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed in the year 70 after the Common Era. Because if it was destroyed in the year 70, let's now go 1,000 years later. 1,000 years later would become 1070. 1,100 years, he says 1,100. So 1,100 years later would be 1170. Right? 1070 is 1,000 years. 1170 is 1,100 years. 1,100 years. And the Rambam says, and in the 8th year, this is the time I'm writing. The 8th year. So that would be 1177. You see, I got from 70 to 1070 to 1170. In the 8th year, 1170. What would this be in the Hebrew calendar? The destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash was in the year 3,000 since creation, 3,830. So the Rambam says, now add 1,000 years and another 100 years, 1,100 years plus the 8th year. So this would be 4,937. Because if the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed 3830, so add 1,000 years, so it's 4830. Now add another 100 years, it's 4930, 4,930 in the 8th year. So it's 4,937 since creation of the world. We already started going into the 8th year. That's when the Rambam is writing this introduction. As some of the commentators point out, there are different parts in the Mishneh Torah where the Rambam gives dates of when he was writing these laws. So for example, in the laws of Kiddush HaChodesh, the laws connected to the new moon, in chapter 11, the Rambam mentions the date of the composition of the text as 4938, which means 1 year later. Later in the Rambam, in Hilchas Shmita V'Yovel, he mentions the date 4936, 1 year earlier, which means that the Rambam didn't write the Mishneh Torah in a few months or even in 1 year. This was written over a few years. He also went back and revised earlier things he wrote in later years, because later we see a later law he's writing in the year 1176, and this is 1177. It could be he wrote the introduction after he wrote the work, or he wrote the introduction, and then later he went back and he revised the introduction. Whatever the case is, this becomes very significant. It's the year 1177. If the Rambam was born, you remember when the Rambam was born? I said it the other day. Slipped my mind. 1138. 1135, many say 1138. If he was born 1138, this means that when did he write this? 1138, so 48, 58, 68, 78. So the Rambam was 39 years old. The Rambam was born 1135, so 45, 55, 65, 75. I'm sorry. If the Rambam was born 1135, so then he was 42 years old. 45, 55, 77, he was 42 years old. If he was born 1138, so then he was a few years younger. 48, 58, 68, 78, yes, he was 39 years old. These are the years when the Rambam is writing the Mishneh Torah Yad HaChazaka. Of course, he would live till the age of 69, almost 70, a few months before he turned 70. So, the Rambam now gave us the history after the Talmud. You have the hundreds of years of the Gaonim, and the Rambam says all of these Gaonim were involved in God's work to present halacha to the Jewish people in a way that is accessible to people who already can't go back to the original or it's too difficult for them. They are writing works that explain the Gemara, works that give halacha to people, and they are answering questions from communities all over the world. Here we are introduced for the first time to the concept of shailas or tshuvas, right? They send in questions, they get answers, they compile the answers into works so that it can be used by subsequent teachers and students in that generation and in later generations. The Rambam wrote a very long and elaborate introduction to the Mishnah, where this introduction of Mishneh Torah is more brief and concise. Over there, it's extremely, extremely elaborate. And over there, the Rambam mentions the names of some of the texts that he refers to as the texts of the Gaonim, and it's worthwhile to mention these texts of the Gaonim. Number 1, halachas g'dailos. Number 2, halachas psukos. Number 1, she'iltos of Reb Achai Gaon. This is known as the she'iltos, and the halachas of Reb Yitzchak Alfasi. The Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak of Fez, Morocco, Alfasi. Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, he wrote also halachas. It's printed at the end of every Gemara. You will see there's a section called the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. This is one of the works that the Rambam is referring to when he wrote about the works that the Gaonim wrote. And now we are reading the words written in 1177, 1100 years after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, plus the 8th year. Says the Rambam, Ubizman hazeh, these days, Tokfu hatzaris yiseris, the distress, the challenges of our people have become increasingly worse. V'dochaka ashas hakoil. This life of everybody is stressful. People are financially and other ways extremely stressed and tight. It's difficult. And the wisdom of our sages has been lost, and the perceptiveness of those of us who had perception has been concealed. Thus, all the commentary, the laws, the responses that the Gaonim composed over the last few hundred years, and they felt that it was clear and self-explanatory. Today, these texts became difficult and nobody understands them well. Very few people can really master them. Even the texts of the Gaonim are incomprehensible to most, besides a few special minds. Now talk about the Talmud itself. He says the Babylonian Talmud, the Yerushalmi, the Sifra, the Sifri, the Tosefta, which were all composed before the Talmud Bavli. You remember we learned Bavli by Reb Ashi, Yerushalmi by Reb Yochanan, who was a student of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Sifra and Sifri by Rav, Tosefta by Reb Chia, student of Rav. And the other works the Rambam mentioned earlier, like the Brises of Reb Oishia, the Medrashim, and Mechilta, all these, he says, require a das rechava. Das rechava means an expansive mind, a breadth of knowledge. Nefesh chachama, a wise, perceptive soul, and a lot of time. And then you could deduce from these texts the proper path of what is forbidden, what is permitted, and all of the other laws of Torah. And because of this, Na'arti chatzni ani Moshe ben Maimon Asfardi v'nishanti ala tzur baruchu. I have girded my loins, I, Moshe the son of Maimon the Sfardi, the man from Spain, and I leaned on the rock, blessed be he, leaning, finding support in Hashem. I leaned on the rock, ubi noisi b'chalelu asfar. I learned and delved into and contemplated all of the texts. V'ra'isi lechabed dvarim hamizborim mikolelu hachiburim be'inyena asur v'hamotor ha'tameh v'ha'toyer im sh'ar dinei ha'torah. and I felt it was appropriate to compose a work with the conclusions of everything that emerges from all of the composed texts about what is forbidden and what is permitted, what is impure, what is pure, and all the other laws of Torah. Kulam, all of them. B'lashon brura v'derech tzara. In a clear language and in concise language. Brura means clear. And tzara, brief, concise, sharp. Those are the two definitions the Rambam gives to his work. Lashon brura, clear and concise. To the point that all of Torah Shebaal Peh, the entire body of the oral tradition of Judaism, which means not the debates, the questions, and the sources, but all of the laws of the whole Torah Shebaal Peh that were transmitted from Moshe Rabbeinu all the way down to the generations, all of the laws that were deduced in later generations from the texts, anything that was added as a rabbinic injunction or protection, all of it should be organized in the mouth of every Jew, without questions, without objections. It shouldn't be filled with debates. You read a text, this one says this one says this one questions this one answers this one takes it apart, this one takes it further apart. No. My objective is dvarim berurim. I want clear words, kroivim, accessible, nechoinim, correct. Al pi mishpat asher yizborim mikol elu achiburim va'pirushim hanimtzoim mimos Rabbeinu HaKadosh v'adachshav. According to the verdict, according to the judgment that emerges from all of the texts and all of the commentary that exists from the days of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who was the first one to take Torah Shebaal Peh and put it into an official text, which we call the Mishnah. And Rabbeinu HaKadosh lived approximately 1,000 years before the Rambam. Around 1,000 years, 800, Rabbeinu HaKadosh lived in the beginning of the 200s, the beginning of the 3rd century. The Rambam is now writing at the end of the 12th century. So we're talking about close to a millennium. All the texts from Rabbeinu HaKadosh till now, everything that emerges. To the point, here is the objective. She'iyu kol hadinin gluyin lekatan ulegadol bedin kol mitzvah mitzvah. All of the laws of all of Judaism should be available and revealed, clear, lekatan ulegadol, for the young and the old, for the person who's young in years, the person who's elder in years, for the person who has a lower intellectual stature or capability, and the person who has a grand intellectual stature. This is a work for all of them. Bedin kol mitzvah, mitzvah in the law of every single mitzvah, the 630 mitzvahs, but each mitzvah has so many details and intricacies. Ubedin kol advarim shetiknu chachamim and neviim, including the laws, not only the 1630 mitzvahs, but also everything that was instituted by the prophets and the sages. Klolei shel davar, let me sum up my mission statement. Here the Rambam articulates his mission statement in this work. Kidei shelo yehi adam tzarech lechibur acher ba'olam midin midinei Yisrael. My mission statement is that no human being should require any other work, any other volume in the world in order to know any law that pertains to Jewish law. If you want to learn other things, you will need other volumes. But if you want to know halach, if you want to know all of Jewish law, and this includes also the laws that are not relevant to the times of the Rambam, the laws of the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the laws of the times of Mashiach. If you want to master every single law in Judaism, from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu till today, the Rambam says, my objective is you should not need any other chibur ba'olam. You should not need any other work. It's all going to be here in this work. I want this chibur, this composition, to encompass the entire oral tradition of Torah. And this includes all the institutions, all the customs, all the decrees that were made from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu until the composition of the Talmud. And he says till the composition of the Talmud, because remember, after the Talmud was created, no institutions oblige all the Jewish people. According and consistent with the commentaries of the Geonim in all of their texts that they composed after the Talmud. That's why I gave this work the following name, Mishneh Torah. Mishneh Torah means the second to Torah. Mishneh, like from the word Mishneh Lamelech, the second to the king. Sheni, Mishneh, Mishneh Torah, the second to the Torah. What do I mean? Lefisha Adam Koire b'Torah shebeksav tchila, v'achakach Koire bazeh, v'yudei memenu Torah sheba pekula, v'ein tzarich likra sefer acher b'nei. The objective is a person should first read through the whole Torah shebeksav, the whole Tanakh, 24 books of Torah, 5 books of Moshe, all the prophets, the Nevi'im, Yeshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, Yeshaya, Yirmiyah, Yecheskel, Treyasser, and then you have the Ksuvim, the writings, like Psalms and Proverbs, Song of Songs, Megillas Esther, Megillas Eicha, Kehelis. You read through the whole Torah Shebeksav. And then you read this work that the Rambam is about to begin to write, Mishneh Torah of the Rambam, and what happens? And you know the whole Torah Shebeksav. You know all of the laws of Judaism, of the oral tradition, which are not in the Tanakh, and you do not need to read any other sefer. So you have the Torah, and then you have the second to the Torah, Mishneh Torah. Torah Shebeksav is the written Torah, and the Rambam's Mishneh Torah is that which complements and fills in the gap of that which was communicated over the generations orally, and that which was deduced over the generations orally, and that which was instituted over the generations orally. Remember those 3 categories that he keeps on referring to? That which was transmitted orally, that which was deduced over the generations, new circumstances, new laws, and that which was introduced in later generations as rabbinic mitzvahs or injunctions or safeguards. All of this is now in the Mishneh Torah, the second Torah, and you do not need any other chibur, you do not need any other work. And that's why the Rambam says, Na'arti chotzni, I girded my loins. Or there's another version, Shinasti masnai. I really, this required so much empowerment. I empowered myself. I girded my loins. I mobilized myself to do this work of such magnitude. I mean, you see the responsibility he's accepting upon himself. The gap that he feels he is going to fill here. To the point, you have Tanakh, you have the work of the Rambam Mishneh Torah, and you don't need any other chibur. If you want to learn Gemara, of course, you can learn Gemara. But if you, in terms of knowing halacha, every halacha in Torah, of the whole Torah Shabbat Peh, you don't need any other work. That's what the Rambam writes. This teaches us a lot. I'm going to share with you one insight I heard myself in 1986, 85. I heard from the Lubavitcher Rebbe shortly after he suggested the daily learning of Rambam. He said, if you remember, the Rambam opens the introduction with a pasuk in Tehillim, Kuf Yud Tesvav, Tehillim 119:6, Ozle Eivaj Ba'abiti Al Kol Mitzvah. I will not be ashamed when I gaze at all of your mitzvahs. Why did the Rambam choose this verse as the opening of his introduction? At the surface level, it's because the Rambam is saying, when a person sees all the mitzvahs, it eliminates shame. Until I look at all the mitzvahs, Ba'abiti Kol Mitzvah, my life is maybe not maximized. I'm not living my full potential as the conduit and as the ambassador of Hashem in this world, and all the mitzvahs represent everything that I'm representing in my life. But the Rambam may also be saying something personal, and that's it. And that's the following. Look at his breitkeit. How much, in Yiddish, the word breitkeit, how much, say, guts for the Rambam to make such a statement. I girded my loins. I, Moshe ben Maimon the Sfardi, I leaned on the rock of God. I leaned on the rock of God. Such boldness, and I'm composing the one work that is going to be the ultimate work that complements the Tanakh, and you don't need any other sefer. Wow. And these words, by the way, did not go down so easily. Here, we come and we're introduced to the Hasagas HaRaavad. We're going to have a chance yet to talk about the Raavad, but very briefly. This is important information because the Raavad is going to come up throughout the Mishneh Torah. The Raavad was older than the Rambam. He was born around 1120, which means he was approximately 18 years older than the Rambam. The Raavad is an acronym, Rabbeinu Avraham ben David. Avraham ben David. There were 3 Raavids. He's the third one. He lived in France, in the province, in southern France. He's known as the Ravid. He, throughout the Mishneh Torah, he writes comments on the Rambam, very often arguing with him and sometimes very sharply. They're known as Hasagas HaRavid. So you'll know now, Ravid is Rabbeinu Avram ben David. He's known as Ravid of Pasquires, which is the city, the area, the region in southern France where he lived, Pasquires. Rabbeinu Avram ben David. He, right here, criticizes the Rambam very sharply. If you have the Rambam, I have it, Hasagas HaRavid. I'll read to you what the Ravid says because this is worthwhile to read in order to appreciate what the Rambam is saying. The Ravid says, and I quote, you can open your Rambam and see it there. It's on the side of the text of the Rambam. Amar Avram, Zah mechaber savar l'saken v'loi tike. Ki hu ozav derech kol ha-mechab ma shahoyu lefonov. Ki hei mevi raya l'divreim v'kosva advarim b'shem oimram v'ailu b'zet hayelas g'dayla. This author, the Rambam, he tried to repair, he tried to do the right thing. But he did not. He neglected, he abandoned the way of all of the authors till his day. They always bring proofs to their words. They always quote the people from where they got their verdict from. And he says this is a great benefit. You know why it's a great benefit? Because sometimes a judge wants to give a particular verdict. He has a source for his verdict. Let's say he wants to say this animal is kosher to eat, or this person is not guilty, whatever the situation is. But he doesn't know that one of the greatest authorities in halacha disagreed with him, and he found another source. And if he would know that this great sage disagreed with him because he had another source, this judge today would retract. He would retract from his position. But he says, with the Rambam, he doesn't give any sources. Remember, he doesn't quote any debates. He doesn't quote any questions. He doesn't quote any refutations. He doesn't quote any arguments. He takes out the verdict, the law, the way he understood it from all the texts. So the Ravid says a few lines later, I am a judge, the Ravid says. I have a particular verdict. I open up a Rambam, he disagrees with me. Is this enough to make me retract my position? The Rambam didn't give me his source, so I don't know if this verdict is coming from somebody who's really much greater than me, and therefore I should surrender my mind, my opinion to his, or maybe not. Maybe I'm greater than him. I don't know. The Ravid says, you have to quote. Tell me where you're getting it from. Why you're deciding this position against this position. The Gaonim argued about a lot of things. The Rambam took the side that he agreed with. The Ravid says, why should I agree with him? Maybe I want the other side. I have to see both sides. I have to see. I can't just rely on him. I don't know who argued with him. Maybe that person was worthy of arguing with him and his position should be considered. The Ravid says that the Rambam here was going beyond the limits of where a human being should be. This is too presumptuous. He had an extra spirit in him, which the Ravid doesn't see as positive. In other words, that the Rambam elevated the role of his book and the status of his book to a place which was inappropriate. The Ravid. Older than the Rambam, 12th century, born around 10, 20 years before the Rambam. The Kesef Mishneh, another great commentator on the Rambam. Every page of the Rambam is surrounded by the Kesef. Who's the Kesef Mishneh? Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo is the author of Shulchan Aruch. He lives in the 15th century. He was born approximately in the year 1488, according to most versions in Spain. He left Spain, 1488. He travels to different locations. He settles in Tzfas, in the Holy Land. He passes away in the 1570s. So he's a Jew from the 15th century and the 16th century. He's most famous because he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. But before the Shulchan Aruch, he wrote a commentary on the Torah known as the Beis Yosef. And before that, he writes a commentary on the Rambam called Kesef Mishneh. His name was Yosef. And so he lives in the 1500s. The Ravid and the Rambam lived in the 1100s, a few hundred years later. The Kesef Mishneh often defends the Rambam from the Ravid. And here too, the Kesef Mishneh says, and I'm going to read a few words after he quotes the Ravid, he says, V'ani yomer I say shetam Rabbeinu. Our Rebbe, the Rambam, had a good reason. I say if the Rambam would have been like all the other authors, he would have not given us the benefit he wanted to give us. You already have Rabbi Yitzchak Ilfos, who at the end of every Gemara compiles all of the halachas, and the Rambam usually follows him. But over there, it's filled with so many different associations. It's not so organized, it's not so clear, it's not so brief. There are still debates. It's separated in different tractates. The Rambam wanted to give us something sharp, brief, clear, like the Mishnah itself. And he says, and every sage could rely on his choice, on the Rambam's choices. And you know what? He says, if there is a great sage and a great genius who doesn't want to rely on the Rambam, he feels that the Rambam's choice of what the verdict is should be questioned. He wants to revisit everything. Says the Kesef Mishnah, who's stopping him? Go back to all the books that the Rambam used. Go back and find the sources and make your own decision. Nobody's stopping you. You can go back there. I say that the path that the Rambam chose fixed up the whole world. It was something beneficial for the whole Jewish world. Besides one in a generation who doesn't want to rely on it and wants to go back to the sources, go back to the sources. And you know what? Even for that one genius of a generation who really wants to go back to the sources and do the work of the Rambam himself, the Rambam did well for him too. You know why? Sometimes he's in a rush. He doesn't have time. He knows that the Rambam says this, he could rely on it. He could rely on the Rambam if he's in a rush. And even if he's not in a rush and he wants to research everything, thank God he has the Rambam, because it's not a small thing to know how the Rambam believed, what the Rambam thought. So even for him, it's beneficial to see the verdict of the Rambam. This is how the Kesef Mishnah defends the Rambam from the Ravid. I should note, historical, interesting fact that is, years later, the Rambam wrote a letter to a student of his, and he says that he did regret that he did not write the sources of every single law in the Mishneh Torah. Even though the Rambam says here he doesn't want to write questions and refutations and arguments. Why? Somebody came to him and asked him for the source of something he wrote, and he was certain it was in one place, and then he was certain it was in another place, and then he was certain it was in another place, and really it was elsewhere. It was scattered somewhere, and the Rambam didn't recall it immediately. It took him time. The Rambam says if the author himself had to go back and figure out where I took it from, what about all my readers? So the Rambam did feel that he should have put in the sources. But in reality, at this point, the Rambam decided not to put in any sources, just to give the final verdict in the halacha, and we see what his ambition is. Where does the Rambam get this breitkeit, this power? That's why he opens the pasuk. A person has to know his potential in life. The Rambam says, when I know that I looked and I studied and I comprehended and I mastered all the mitzvahs, which means not only the Tanakh, the Mishnah and the Bavli, and Yerushalmi and Tosefta and Sifra and Sifri and Mechiltad Rebbe Akiva, Mechiltad Rebbe Shmuel, and all the Chiburim of the Gaonim, and all of the commentaries and all of the Midrashim, and I mastered it all. Ozlei Eivosh. Now is not the time for shame. Now is not the time for fake humility. Now is not the time to say, who am I? What am I? Who do I think I am? That's why he begins with this pasuk, Ozlei Eivosh. When you know that you have mastered something, now you have a responsibility to yourself, to the people, to the world, to God, to Jewish history, to take a pen and give people the experience of Kol Mitzvah. Ozlei Eivosh, as the Rambam himself quotes later from the Gemara Masechta Saita, that just like a person who doesn't know halacha and he starts giving people guidance, it's a terrible crime. An equal crime is somebody, Kol Mi Shehigia Lo'irav Einei Moira, somebody who could teach, somebody who could guide, somebody who could mentor, and he doesn't, he abstains. That is an equal crime. You would think, oh, I'm humble. No, you were given this gift. Atsumim kol arugeh, very sharp words about somebody who has the ability to lead, guide, mentor, teach, give, and he or she abstains from it. Ozlei Eivosh ba'abiti al kol mitzvah. The Rambam says, knowing that I could rely on the rock, I'm doing Hashem's work. I'm relying on the rock. The Rambam, in his great humility, and the humility of the Rambam is seen throughout every word of his writing. Any work, you could see the humility of the Rambam, understood this is his role, this is part of his mission in life. Ozle Evash Bahabiti Al Kol Mitzvesach. The Rambam says, after my book, you don't need anything else. Is this hubris? Is this pompous? Even if it's unprecedented and gigantic, can you say such a thing? Would the Chafetz Chaim say such a thing? Would Rabbi Yosef Karo say such a thing? Would the Vilna Gaon say such a thing? Would the Alter Rebbe say such a thing? It's very important to emphasize this again and again. It would be intellectually dishonest and foolish to accuse the Rambam of arrogance. Anyone who learns the Rambam's works, reads his letters, even superficially, you could see the profound humility that this person professed. Incredible. I believe that to argue that is really ignoring and denying the facts. And not just from a place of faith and, hopeful wishes, but from literally reality of studying the Rambam and anything we know about him. And also reading what he writes about humility and reading what he writes about hypocrisy. We're going to get there. In Hilchos Deis, the laws of ethics, he discusses humility and he discusses hypocrisy. The way the Rambam writes about humility, you see what he believed about humility. But of course, this has to be understood completely different. And that's why I explained what I heard from the Rebbe, the Lubavitch Rebbe, Ozle Evoish Ba'abiti Al Kol Mitzvesach. When you know that God blessed you with a specific skill, talent, gift, resource, perception, wisdom, and ability, not to use it to its fullest measure and degree is actually a betrayal of the mission which your soul was sent down to the world for. And to say, I'm humble, I'm a humble person, I'm embarrassed, I'm shy. If you know that you mastered all the mitzvahs and there is a desperate need in the Jewish world for your contribution, you don't have a right to abstain, even if you are truly humble and self-effacing. The Rambam here was not celebrating his prowess, his genius, his skill. After me, you don't need anybody else. The Rambam was celebrating here the light that God was transmitting through him. Listen to my words. The Rambam was celebrating himself as a conduit. V'nishanti al atzur. I'm completely supported by the rock. I'm just a representative of the Tzur. Tzur Yisrael v'goyale, the rock of Israel and its Redeemer. That's the words he writes. Tzur. Why does he use the word Tzur for Hashem? Because he wants to bring out that his whole source of confidence, the rock, the strength, the fortitude, comes from the Rebbeinu Shalom. I rely on this rock. To do what? To fill this void, that people should be able to master and know all of halacha, to the point that they know when they learn the Tanakh and they have this book, they have all of halacha. And the Rambam accentuates it to bring out the great gift that God gave him to be able to give to the Jewish people. I think that is the true way to understand this. Here I have to mention God's sense of humor. What's God's sense of humor? The Rambam says, after you read my book, you don't need any other work in the world. You don't need any other chibur in the world. You have Tanakh, you have Mishneh Torah, you don't need to look in another book for halacha. Now, what's Hashem's sense of humor? There is not a single work in Jewish law and Jewish history that has so many books written on it, like what? Like the Rambam's Mishneh Torah. I'm not talking about 10 books. I'm not talking about 20 books, which is also a lot. I'm not talking about 100 books. I'm talking about thousands of works throughout the generations, from the 1100s until this very day, to elucidate, to explain, to enlighten us, to delve into every word, every sentence, every paragraph, every halacha of the Rambam, from different styles and different perspectives. The Rambam's Mishneh Torah became what a honey, lahavdil, became the honey for the bee, lahavdil. The Rambam's Mishneh Torah became the reference point where every halachic master, teacher, Talmudist, sage, Rosh Yeshiva throughout the generations goes to figure out, first of all, his sources. Because he didn't write sources, everybody went to figure out his sources. to see his definitions, to understand how he learned the Gemara, how he learned the Halacha. The Rambam says, after this, you won't need another work. But after this, more works were added to the library of Judaism than through any other work in Jewish history. Mishneh Torah Yad HaChazaka Rambam. In fact, people were worried. There were those who criticized, you're eliminating the Gemara from the bookshelf. You're eliminating the Gemara. You say Tanakh and you. But Rambam wasn't eliminating Gemara. Rambam was just saying, I want a book where everyone could see all of Halach. Those who are going to learn Gemara, great. But the truth is, through the Rambam, much more learning of Gemara increased than ever before in order to be able to figure out how the Rambam learned the Gemara. From the Rambam, you go back to the Gemara, you want to see how the Rambam saw the Gemara. There were those who said that the many did not use the word Mishneh Torah because of the Ravid's comments and other people's comments that you should make a work that's second to Torah. They felt that, again, this was above the boundaries of a human being. And there's another name that's very popular, maybe more popular for the Rambam's work, called Yad HaChazaka. Yad HaChazaka means the strong arm. It comes from the end of Chumash. Yad HaChazaka Asa Moshe. His name was Moshe ben Maimon. Yad HaChazaka, the strong arm, because Yad is a hand and Yad is Yud Daled, which is 14, because Yad HaChazaka consists of 14 books in which the Rambam categorized and systemized all of Jewish law. So that's also a very popular name called Yad HaChazaka. Did it develop because people didn't want the name Mishneh Torah? Some people say that there were a few individuals in Jewish history who gave very big names, titanic names for their works, and their names did not last. The Rambam's Mishneh Torah is more known as Yad HaChazaka. The Shalah, 16th and 17th century, wrote a sefer called Shnei Luchos Habris, the two tablets of stone. And what is it known? Most people don't say Shnei Luchos Habris, they say Shalah, which is the acronym of Shnei Luchos Habris. And the third one, you know the third one is? The Alshich. The Alshich wrote a commentary called Toras Moshe. His name was Moshe, Reb Moshe Alshich from Tzfas, 1500s Tzfas. We don't call it Toras Moshe, we call it the Alshich. This I once saw, I think the Chidah writes this. Somebody writes, one of the greats writes it, that these three names, Mishneh Torah, Shnei Luchos Habris, and Alshich, Toras Moshe, the Jewish people changed the name a little bit. Yad HaChazaka, Shalah, and Alshich. Very interesting observation. Let's see the last paragraph, another few lines in the Rambam's introduction. So the Rambam gave us a name, he gave us his mission statement, but you learn also from this introduction how to think about what you're going to write. I think in today's generation, it's very important. When everybody has a computer and everybody is writing books and everybody is sending messages and everybody is an expert on everything, or at least many people think they're experts. Look at how a person prepares to write a work. His introduction, how he starts off. He gives you the bird's eye view, the perspective, how things developed until his day. What inspired him? What is the need that he's filling? Whenever you write a work, you have to explain to the people, what void are you filling? What would be missing if you were not here? So many people write books. What would be missing if you didn't write this book? The Rambam articulates here the void, the challenge, the dilemma, the problem, the gap that he is coming to fill. He also articulates a mission statement, what his objective is. And that's why when you read through, you learn through Mishneh Torah, which is it's a long work. You see every line is an expression of this mission statement. The Rambam is sitting one day and he decides to write some interesting poetry. The Rambam has a lot of other works with other genres, with other mission statements. He's loyal to the mission statement. This is the goal. This is the objective. Every single line of Mishneh Torah is going to be a manifestation of this mission statement. There's so much to learn from this introduction outside of the introduction itself. The Rambam finishes. I decided the best way is to divide this work into halachas, which means into sections of laws, different halachas, which means you'll have the laws of tefillin, mezuzah, sefer Torah, the laws of davening, the laws of repentance, the laws of Torah study, the laws of a borrower and a lender, the laws of kings, the laws of judges, the laws of grief, different halachas, the laws of sale, the laws of servants, laws of borrowing, of renting. I'm just throwing out different halachas. Halachas sections, 14 books, but within each book, there's going to be sections. We're going to see there's 83 sections of halachas, 83 categories. The halachas, each halacha is divided into chapters. A halacha can have 10 chapters, can have 3 chapters, it can have 30 chapters or more. There's going to be chapters, all the same theme, and the chapters are organized. Well, first chapter we discussed this, second chapter this. He builds. It's built like a pyramid, very organized. Every chapter is divided into small paragraphs, small sections. We call it small halachas. So for example, whenever you want to reference a Rambam, you're going to say, Mishneh Torah la Rambam, or Yad Chazaka la Rambam, Hilchis Tshuva, the laws of repentance, Perik Aleph, the first chapter, Halacha Gimel, the third section, the third paragraph, or Halacha Dalet, or Halacha Aleph. That's how you reference the Rambam. Why did I do this? So people should be able to memorize it by heart. It should be organized on everybody's mouth, because everything is so referenced and categorized and divided. So you know, the subject is here and there and there, and you go there and you can pinpoint it easily. This is a couple of years pre-Google. These halachas, in every theme of Torah, there are halachas that will only include one mitzvah of Torah. This may be a mitzvah that has a lot of traditions around it, but it's an independent theme. You'll have halachas that include many different mitzvahs, all in this theme. As long as the mitzvahs are about one issue. Because the way I organize this work is not according to the number of mitzvahs. Rather, it's according to themes, topics. So for example, if you go to the laws of repentance, there's only one mitzvah there. It's the mitzvah of repentance. But it has 10 chapters because the mitzvah of tshuva includes a lot. So many details, but they're all in one halacha. You'll have Hilchas Avodah Zarah, the laws of idolatry. That doesn't have one mitzvah. That has in Chumash many, many mitzvahs, but they will all be compressed to Hilchas Avodah Zarah. Why? Because he didn't give every mitzvah a separate halacha. He divided it according to themes. You'll have Hilchas Shabbos. Hilchas Shabbos has many mitzvahs, but they're all in Hilchas Shabbos. It's connected to the celebration and observance of Shabbos. You'll have Hilchas Megillah and Chanukah. That doesn't even have one mitzvah. It's a rabbinic mitzvah of Megillah, mitzvah of Chanukah. The Rambam puts all the laws over there, etc. The number of the mitzvahs of Torah that are relevant for all of the generations are 613 mitzvahs. There are mitzvahs that were only given for that time in history. An example of that would be Parshas Matos. The Rabbi Shalom says that the spoil of Midian, the Jews fought Midian because Midian had this genocidal plan for the Jewish people. The Jews fought Midian and they had a lot of spoil. And Hashem tells Moshe that spoil should be divided equally between the troops who went to fight and all of the other Jews, 50-50, and a tax should be imposed on each part. The part that's given to the Jewish people, 1 of 50, should be given to the Levites, and the part that's given to the troops, 1 of 500, should be given to the high priest Elazar. This is a mitzvah, but it's not a mitzvah that you're going to find in the list of 613 mitzvahs. You know why? It's not for generations. It only applied for that time. So that's why the Rambam says, L'doiros. It's for generations. Now, the mitzvahs in the Beis HaMikdash, they're not applicable now, but they are applicable now. It's just the circumstances are not here. If we would have a Beis HaMikdash, which we should have speedily in our days, the mitzvahs will apply. So that's not called a temporary mitzvah. A mitzvah for generations doesn't mean a mitzvah that we don't do now. It means if we would have the circumstances that would allow us to do the mitzvah, we would do the mitzvah. Just like we're not eating matzah now, not because it's not an eternal mitzvah, it's just because it's not Pesach. If it would be Pesach, we would have the mitzvah of matzah. So that's an important distinction we have to make. Any mitzvah that applies theoretically to all of the generations, even if practically we don't do it now because we can't, I don't have the ability to do it. But if it theoretically applies to all the generations, there's 613 mitzvahs. Now it's interesting, this doesn't say in Chumash. Chumash doesn't give us the number 613. But this is an ancient tradition. The Gemara discusses it at the end of Maseches Makos, that we have a tradition that is 613 mitzvahs. Mehen mitzvahs me'aseh, masayim v'arba'im v'shmeina. Some of them are positive commandments, 248 positive. Siman le'en minyan avarav shel adam. A symbol to remember them is the number of the limbs of a human being, 248. According to the sages, they categorized the human anatomy into 248 limbs and organs. I know in the contemporary number, we usually talk about 206 bones, I believe. So there's been a lot of discussion of how the sages decided to categorize the limbs of the human being, and the number becomes 248, which the Rambam says corresponds to the 248 mitzvahs. Then you have 365 prohibitions that relate to the negative, things that you don't do. There are 248 things that we do, and there are 365 things that we abstain from doing. Siman lehen, a symbol, a sign to remember this number is minyan yemei shnei sachama. The number of days that constitutes a solar year. If we view, from our perspective, if we view the sun making a full orbit around the earth, it takes 365 days and change. 365 days is the number of days that completes every single year the solar orbit, and that's what we call a year. That's why we have a year. What makes a year 365 days? Something objectively happens after 365 days, and the cycle repeats itself, and during that cycle we have all the seasons of spring and summer, etc., because that is the solar year, and that's 365. Now, this is not just random associations, but as the Medrash puts it, and the Rambam quotes it in another work, Sefer HaMitzvahs, that it would be like every single limb talks to the person and says, please, do a mitzvah with me. Utilize me to do a mitzvah so I could fulfill my purpose, and I could be harmonized and aligned with my divine purpose. So each limb of the 248 limbs asks you to do a mitzvah with it. And each day of the 365 days a year asks you, says, please use me productively. Don't take my time and use it for something you should not be doing. It's like every day of the 365 days of the year pleads with you and says, please, carpe diem, seize the day, pun intended, seize the day. Make sure that this day is a day which you utilize in the most productive and powerful way, not to use it for something that you shouldn't be doing. That's the siman of the mitzvahs. 365 things we don't do, 248 things we do. This concludes the Rambam's introduction to Mishneh Torah. From here, the Rambam doesn't start yet the laws. The Rambam now gives a whole list of the 630 mitzvahs. Before he begins to explain them, what are the 630 mitzvahs? That's the next section now. He goes through a list, a brief list, one sentence, each one of the 630 mitzvahs. Then after that, he goes through the 365, 248 and 365, and then afterwards, he gives you a blueprint of his work, how he divided Judaism into 14 books, and in those 14 books, he compressed and he inserted 83 subjects, 83 themes, and each one of those themes has its chapters, as we learned before. And altogether you have 1,000 halachas in the work of the Rambam, because you have 14 books, 83 halachas, but in each one you have chapters, so you have 1,000 prakim, 1,000 chapters. So the Rambam, before he starts the book, he gives you an index, because it's very clear that he wanted here the full scope, the bird's eye view. So he gives an index. He wants you to know all the 630 mitzvahs, and he wants you to see the blueprint of his entire book, of how it's going to be laid out. And then he actually starts the first laws, known as Hilchos Yesodei Torah, the fundamentals of Torah. I think you said that after the Talmud was closed by Rabbi, no court could make a decision affecting all communities, and no decree of Bezdin could bind another one. Don't we have a rule that a Bezdin cannot cancel another Bezdin's ruling if the latter Bezdin is not greater than the earlier one? That only applies to the Sanhedrin. That's all before the Talmud Bavli. The Rambam is talking about post-Talmud Bavli. That law doesn't apply. The edict of a Bezdin in one place does not bind the Jews in another place, even if they're not greater. Were there not groups that did not accept the learning of Rambam? Please list the times of classes in Israel for those of us here in Israel. I live in Beitar Elite, Israel. Yes, you see from the Raivid that there was an opposition. Some people opposed the works of the Rambam, the work of the Rambam, his style. There were other arguments that people had. I mentioned some of them in these words of the Raivid and the Kesef Mishnah. But the fact remains that even if you argued with the Rambam, he became the person to argue with. In other words, his work is considered the greatest halachic work that was written in Jewish history. The greatest or one of the greatest, probably the greatest. So the Rambam's work, whether you agreed, you didn't agree, remember, the Rambam, as the Raivid says, saw arguments and he chose one opinion to give a verdict. He didn't bring the arguments. So the Rambam had to use his own mind often to navigate between different opinions, contentious opinions, and make a decision. The Raivid says, what if I disagree with them? I want to go back to the sources and maybe I'll have a different verdict. The Rambam himself, sometimes the Goyinim are arguing and he makes a verdict. Or there's arguments in the Gemara, or there's arguments elsewhere, and there was no verdict given in Talmud Bavli, or a consensus by the Goyinim, and the Rambam himself will choose the verdict. So some people said, I want to go back. Also, what if the interpretation in Gemara is different? Maybe I have a different interpretation in the Gemara. The Rambam didn't tell you. I went back to the Gemara. You could learn it this way, you could learn it that way. I decided to learn it this way, and therefore this is the verdict. The Rambam doesn't do that. He just gives you the verdict. But it became unbelievably fascinating to Jewish scholars since then to find out what the Rambam thought, how he thought about it. I once heard from Rabbi Yitzchak Twersky, Rabbi Isidore Twersky, who was a son-in-law of Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik. He was also professor of Judaic studies in Harvard University. He was also a genius, and he was also a grandson. Twersky was, he identified himself also as a Rebbe, Tolner Rebbe, and he was a grandson of the Twersky dynasty, Reb Nachum Chernobyl, Reb Mottel Chernobyl, the Chernobyl Maggid. His name was Rabbi Yitzchak Twersky. He passed away a few years ago. He has a son who was killed in Har Nof, I believe. You remember the massacre in Har Nof in the morning? I think that was his son. So Rabbi Yitzchak Twersky, I was once by him Shalashudis in his Shver Shul in Brookline, in Massachusetts. So he told a story. I think he said that he heard it from his father-in-law, that the Beis Halevi, Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, the Beis Halevi, the Rav of Slutsk, Brisk, before the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, they were talking about the Shidduch, a partner, a marriage partner for his son, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Chaim Briske. So he wanted to extol the virtue of his son Reb Chaim, and he said, my son, he said, mein Zun ken ganz Talmud Bavli mit dem Pirush von Rambam. My son knows the whole Babylonian Talmud with the Rambam's commentary. And this raised eyebrows. The Rambam wrote a commentary on many tractates of Gemara, but we don't have them. They were lost. I don't know if you know that. Many Mesechtes of Shas, the Rambam's output was incredibly prolific. That's even the works we have. But there's so many works we don't have from the Rambam. They were lost, tragically lost. We don't have the commentary of the Rambam on Gemara. Besides that, I don't think he wrote a commentary on the whole Gemara. We don't have it. We have, I think, parts of Masechta Rosh Hashanah commentary a little bit. But most of it we don't have. What does he mean? Reb Chaim knows the whole Gemara with the Rambam's commentary. You could say the Gemara with Rashi's commentary, with Tosfos's commentary. But not with, you could say, with the Rashba, with the Ramban, with the Ran, with the Ritva. I mean, with Reb Chaim's commentary. So Rabbi Twersky explained that the Beis Halevi was trying to say that was the greatness of Reb Chaim. When he learned Rambam, he didn't only learn the words of the Rambam. He understood how the Rambam is learning the Gemara. So he learned the whole Gemara with the commentary of the Rambam. So that's why the Rambam, even if you disagreed with his methodology or style, it became a fountainhead of innovation, of awareness, of depth, and of an understanding how to learn the Gemara. And of course, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik developed what's known today as the Brisker Derech in his monumental work, Chidushin Rabbeinu Chaim Alevi al Rambam. That was his path. But then you had so many other commentators. You had a contemporary, the Rokat Shabbat, Sofnas Paneach on the Rambam. And over there, he reveals in the Rambam untold layers of depth. He used to say that the Rambam knew, what you can't learn, and the Rambam knew how to learn. In any case, that's, I think, some of the points here. Next question. Moshe Rabbeinu received the oral Torah, and then there's only one opinion. He didn't teach it this way or that way. By the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi writing the Mishnah, there were discrepancies in the law that crept in. So the truth is that the Rambam says most things that were received from Moshe on Har Sinai, there were no debates. There are maybe a few exceptions. The Rambam himself says there's no exceptions. The Chavos Yair argues with that, but it's not for now. But most things that come from Moshe Rabbeinu, there's no debate. The debates mostly crept in issues that were not clearly articulated in the tradition. For example, new circumstances come up and you have to use the pre-existing text to develop or deduce a new law that relates to new circumstances or even to old circumstances, but certain details and nuances in the law that were never articulated. This is where they had to use the formula of Torah together with their own minds, and that's why there's so many debates. Or sometimes debates sprung up if we should add this safeguard to a mitzvah, or should we add this institution, should we make this custom, make this tradition. This is also where many debates crept in. We read about the Rambam saying that in his times people were so distressed financially, scattered, overwhelmed, wisdom was concealed, people not getting it. It sounds like he's writing in 2020. He's writing in 1177. At the time of the Rambam, circa 1200, in England, the source of English common law, which is the source of American law, when one person claimed another owed him money, a court case, they settled it by getting on their horses with long spears, and the survivors of the battle won the court case. The earliest semblance of written organized laws in England were the Blackstone commentaries in the 1600s. Yes, that is amazing. That is amazing. The Rambam is writing this in 1177, and he's not inventing. He's articulating a tradition that goes back thousands of years. And you say at 1200 in England, which is the source of English common law, the source of American law, the levels of barbarity and primitiveness were quite horrific.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.